The Gulf is tense tonight, and the language coming from Tehran is as stark as it is threatening. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC has issued what it calls a strategic warning to the United States and its partners, saying any fresh attack will be met with a response that exceeds the enemy's expectations. The message, couched in the blunt rhetoric of deterrence, arrives as efforts at diplomacy appear to have stalled in Islamabad and as regional maritime tensions over the Strait of Hormuz sharpen. In a statement, the IRGC warned that Iran would escalate the severity of its retaliation against any new attacks by the United States or the Israeli regime. The statement went on to say, any further aggression from the enemy camp and the ill wishes of this land will undoubtedly be met with a response beyond the enemy's expectations at a level of strategic deterrence. Those are not throwaway lines. They are a deliberate signal from one of the most powerful institutions, New Iran's security architecture, a body that has both conventional and asymmetric capabilities across the Gulf, the Sea of Oman and beyond. Those comments come alongside a separate warning from Iran's Khatam al-Anbar central headquarters, the command layer closely associated with the IRGC's strategic planning. In a statement dated April 25, the headquarters said it would treat what it calls naval piracy, blockade and banditry by American forces in the region as grounds for a decisive response. It added that Iranian forces now operate with greater strength and readiness to defend their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national interests. And again emphasized that Tehran would continue to control transit through Hormuz even after the current conflict ends. Those assertions are bound up with a concrete operational move. Iranian authorities have tightened transit rules through the Strait of Hormuz, allowing coordinated passage for all ships except those linked to the unit. It states, the Israeli regime and affiliated entities, Tehran's posture is clear. Control of maritime access to the strait remains a central lever in its defensive and coercive toolkit. At the same time, Western media outlets have reported that US planners have mulled more robust options in the Gulf, including the possible temporary deployment of American forces to islands near Iran's coast, aimed at pressuring Tehran to relax restrictions on shipping. Tehran describes any such measures as tantamount to piracy and sovereignty violations. The two sides are increasingly speaking past one another, and the danger of miscalculation is growing. Diplomacy has been stretched thin. Pakistan stepped in this month as a mediator, hosting rounds of talks meant to build on a short-lived ceasefire earlier this spring. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Arabki traveled to Islamabad to engage with Pakistani mediators and, according to Iranian officials, to share Tehran's position on ending the war. But those negotiations collapsed without a breakthrough. Iran rejected what it called excessive US demands, and Washington has privately acknowledged that it faces limits in what it can secure without Tehran's buy-in. The situation was further complicated by a public and very personal intervention from President Donald Trump. At various points this week, the White House announced that the president would send a small team of envoys, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to Islamabad to resume talks with Iranian officials. Vice President JDD Vance was reported to have been standing by in Washington in case his presence was required. But the plan unraveled quickly when the president reversed course, cancelling the trip and framing the decision in blunt populist terms. On air and in public comments, the president dismissed the logistics and the politics of the trip. He said, in part, we're not going to spend 15 hours in airplanes all the time going back and forth to be, giving a document that was not good enough. And so we'll deal by telephone, and they can call us anytime they want. Again, we have all the cards. They have no military left, practically. They have no leaders left. We don't know who the leaders are. Nobody knows who the leader. I don't think they know who the leaders are, very importantly. That language, dismissive, self-assured, underscores both the posture of pressure and a refusal to be seen making concessions in person. The result: a diplomatic pause, a return to hard power posturing, and new public threats from Tehran's inner circle. The senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, Mohsen Rezai, wrote on social media to warn that Iran stands unified, integrated, and of one voice while casting American power as brittle and destined to break. He wrote, and I quote, "With the strong hand of Iran's valiant sons and the tightly knit ranks of the devoted nation, the sound of America's broken bones will echo from the Persian Gulf and the essay." ear of Oman to the ears of the world. The imagery is intentionally visceral and designed to be heard beyond Iran's borders. For analysts watching the region, the combination of explicit threats from the IRGC and Khatam al-Anabiyah, military moves at sea, and the collapse of talks in Pakistan creates an unnerving dynamic, the era of low-level incidents and managed crises that has characterized Gulf politics may be giving way to something more open-ended and dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract geopolitical talking point, it is a narrow maritime choke point through which a significant share of the world's oil and gas supplies transit. Any disruption there, whether through mines, missile attacks, harassment of commercial shipping, or a naval standoff, would have immediate global economic consequences. Iran's statements were explicit about escalation options. The IRGC said it was prepared to confront various enemy actions, including ground operations, and even went so far. Has to note that prisoners of war camps have been prepared to house potential aggressors. Those are the kinds of phrases that ratchet up the rhetoric internationally and raise questions about contingency planning on both sides. From Washington's perspective, the choices are fraught. Officials have publicly framed their actions as defending freedom of navigation and deterring attacks on commercial shipping, and they have signaled that a return to diplomacy remains possible if Tehran shows seriousness. But the bipartisan political context at home, domestic pressures within allied capitals, and the strategic calculus in the region all constrain maneuverability. Sending envoys then cancelling their trip plays into Tehran's narrative that the US sending envoys then cancelling their trip plays into Tehran's narrative of the US preemptness. It is unpredictable, yet staying away risks ceding the initiative to hardliners on both sides. Pakistan's role as a mediator has also been awkward and revealing. Islamabad has attempted to position itself as a neutral facilitator and its leaders. HIP, civil and military, has publicly urged a negotiated path. But the collapse of the Pakistan-hosted talks highlights how difficult it is for a third party to bridge the structural security dilemmas at play. The US seeks assurances that Iran will not resume actions it deems destabilizing. Iran seeks security guarantees and relief from sanctions and pressure, and Israel's position on the conflict looms in the background, complicating the bargaining space. On the ground, the maritime picture has already shown flashes of kinetic danger. There have been reports, verified by coalition maritime tracking centers, of Iranian vessels firing on or challenging tankers in the strait, and images circulating from the region show naval encounters that could have been worse. Every close call at sea increases the chance that a misread signal becomes an exchange of fire, and that in turn could draw in allies with pre-existing security commitments. The international costs of escalation are not light. Lighter to oil prices, they include the risk of a wider regional conflagration and humanitarian fallout. Tehran's approach is strategic, by restricting passage for American-linked vessels, and by publicly tying control of the strait to national sovereignty, Iran is forcing a choice. Recalibrate naval tactics, accept heightened risk to shipping lanes, or find diplomatic pathways that remove maritime coercion from the table. Iranian leaders believe they have the leverage. Western capitals worry that this leverage could translate into unacceptable interference with global trade or open the door to an armed confrontation. That is why the rhetoric matters as much as the movements. When a senior military command publicly declares that it will inflict even more severe losses on American or Israeli forces in the event of new violations, it is not just a domestic message of resolve. It is also a strategic signal meant to shape the calculations of rivals, allies, and neutrals. The Iranian leader, Chip, is trying to broaden the costs that any potential attacker would face, to make the massive a strike, even a limited one, significantly less appealing. Which brings us back to the central diplomatic puzzle. Is there a realistic path to de-escalation short of a clear and enforceable agreement? Iran says it shared its position on ending the war during talks in Pakistan, but has cast doubt on whether the United States is genuinely committed to diplomacy. The US, for its part, has extended a ceasefire unilaterally at times and has pushed for further talks, but officials in Tehran complain of coercion, military pressure, and a tightening blockade that undercuts trust. Any breakthrough would require three things: credible verification mechanisms, reciprocal steps that reduce the incentives for renewed hostilities, and a third-party guarantor that both sides trust enough to keep the process honest. None of those are easy to achieve, and mutual mistrust has hardened after months of sea. Flicked. On flicked and a series of tit-for-tat moves, the presence of envoys like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who Washington described as special envoys for peace missions, signaled an attempt at a small, nimble diplomatic channel. The abrupt cancellation of their travel and the president's insistence on phone-level engagement undercuts that approach. For regional states, the stakes are immediate. Gulf monarchies are watching tanker routes and defense postures. Europe is tracking supply chain impacts and weighing sanctions and diplomatic initiatives. Moscow and Beijing are quietly positioning themselves as interlocutors, while also hedging their bets in a region where energy security and strategic influence intersect. For smaller states in the Gulf, the calculus is about survival. How to avoid being pulled into a larger conflict while maintaining economic lifelines. The human cost must be kept at the center of any sober assessment. Civilians in conflict zones have been displaced. Merch and mariners and their crews face renewed peril, and the longer instability persists, the deeper its economic and social toll. When military warnings and nationalistic rhetoric dominate public discourse, it is everyday lives, not geopolitical abstractions, that pay the price. So where does this leave us? At present, the situation is balanced on a knife edge. Iran's military posture and public warnings suggest a readiness to escalate if it perceives existential threats to its interests. Washington's posture combines deterrence with the offer of diplomacy, but erratic choices and public politicization of negotiations complicate the signal it sends. Pakistan's mediation showed that outside actors can create space for talks, but that space is fragile and requires sustained, credible engagement to produce results. If a voice of restraint is to prevail, it will require 3 practical moves. De-escalatory measures at sea to reduce the chance of accidental clashes, a clear diplomatic channel with compact negotiation objectives and verification, and shared international pressure to make escalation costly for spoilers. Absent those steps, the risk calculus on all sides will keep tilting toward more provocative measures rather than restraint. For now, the Gulf's watchwords are unpredictability and deterrence. Tehran's language, a response beyond the enemy's expectations, is intended to widen the perceived costs of confrontation. Washington's decisions about envoys, about ceasefires, and about maritime operations will determine whether that widened cost is enough to force bargaining or enough to push both sides into a collision neither wants. This remains a developing story, one with immediate implications for regional security, international trade, and the lives of people caught between rival strategic ambitions. The coming days will test whether diplomacy can be revived and stabilized, or whether bluster will give way to darker outcomes. Either way, the world is warped. Qing, the narrow waterway that has always been more than geography. It is a strategic choke point, a bargaining chip, and now, once again, a potential flashpoint for wider conflict.